The Second World War is usually framed as a grand moral drama. Democracy versus fascism, liberty facing down tyranny, the fate of millions hanging in the balance. Leaders deliver speeches, flags wave, soldiers fight, and textbooks distill the chaos into tidy arcs of villainy and heroism. Yet beneath the uniforms and the rhetoric lies a less romantic, equally decisive reality. Wars run on money. Tanks do not roll, bombers do not fly, and armies do not march without a river of capital to sustain them. And where that money moves, bankers stand people bound less by national anthems than by ledgers, less by borders than by balance sheets and the calculus of risk and return. However uncomfortable it is to admit, the Second World War, for all its carnage, became an era of opportunity for certain financiers. Some learned how to minimize exposure by dealing with multiple sides. Others profited from loans, patents, commodities, and the silent, persistent machinery of international settlements. The battlefield may have produced winners and losers. The counting houses were structured so that their owners could win regardless of the flag that ended up on the city hall. By the way, if you love money, subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Now let's continue. To understand how that reality emerged, we have to start earlier, amid the wreckage that followed the First World War. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparations on Germany, obligations so heavy that the Weimar economy collapsed into hyperinflation by 1923. Savings evaporated, prices spiraled by the hour, and ordinary life became an improvised barter. Into that crisis stepped international banks, especially in New York and London, whose loans were framed as stabilization but structured as profitable opportunities. The Dawes Plan of 1924, followed by the Young Plan in 1929, reorganized payments and opened channels for American credit to flood into Germany. Major houses, J.P. Morgan and Co., Dillon, Reed, and others extended lines of financing, backed in part by German tax revenues. These inflows supported Weimar's fragile recovery and, inadvertently, laid foundations for industrial resurgence. In factories rebuilt with foreign capital, expertise and machines accumulated, the very capacities that would later be mobilized for rearmament. When Adolf Hitler seized power in 1933, his program demanded rapid militarization, a path explicitly prohibited by Versailles. Yet rearmament did not materialize in a vacuum. It drew on capital, technology, and cooperation that crossed borders even as Nazi ideology preached autarky and war. German industrial giants IG Farben, Krupp, and Thyssen, among them, benefited from foreign investment and access to patents. In the 1930s, several American corporations maintained deep ties to these firms. Standard Oil exchanged technology and fuel additives essential for synthetic gasoline. General Motors, through Opel, and Ford's German subsidiary, produced vehicles that served the Wehrmacht. IG Farben, a conglomerate entangled with Wall Street finance, turned chemistry into strategy. Synthetic fuels, explosives precursors, and rubber all crucial to a Germany short on natural resources, yet hungry for power. Across the Channel, the Bank of England navigated its own uneasy priorities. Governor Montagu Norman cultivated a collegial relationship with Hjalmar Schacht, the architect of Nazi monetary policy at the Reichsbank. That relationship extended to decisions that, in retrospect, read as chillingly technocratic. In 1939, after Germany occupied Prague, gold reserves belonging to Czechoslovakia that were held in London were transferred to the Reichsbank. The justification was contractual. The consequence was moral dissonance. The episode laid bare a recurring calculus in high finance. The sanctity of obligations and the smooth functioning of markets could, at times, outrank political outrage. Meanwhile, in the United States, financial entanglements continued to snake through boardrooms and subsidiaries. The Union Banking Corporation in New York connected to the German industrialist Fritz Thyssen. An early and generous supporter of Hitler counted among its directors Prescott Bush, father of a future American president. In 1942, once the war had engulfed multiple continents and U.S. policy shifted decisively, the government seized UBC's assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act. The seizure did not erase the years of profitable relations that had preceded it. It merely drew a legal line under a period when doing business with Nazi-linked interests had been possible, and, for some, desirable. Once the shooting started in 1939, the architecture of wartime finance grew far more complex. Neutral institutions, particularly those based in Switzerland, became conduits through which assets, payments, and gold moved. The Bank for International Settlements, BIS, founded in 1930 to facilitate German reparations and foster cooperation among central banks, exemplified the paradox. Headquartered in Basel, the BIS kept operating throughout the war. Around its table sat representatives from countries trying to annihilate each other on the battlefield. The BIS provided a venue for settlements, discussions, and the handling of assets, including, controversially, German gold. Some of that gold had been looted from occupied treasuries, some, in the ghastliest cases, derived from Nazi plunder of private citizens and Holocaust victims. Critics later argued that the BIS became a shield for the Reich's financial survival by offering a legal channel for cross-border transfers. Defenders countered that keeping the circuitry of international finance alive would prove essential for eventual reconstruction. The uncomfortable truth is that both claims hold pieces of reality, and that the people best positioned to benefit were those in banking. Funding both sides did not always mean cutting checks to two enemies from the same account. Often it meant a web of subsidiaries, licensing agreements, and patent swaps that blurred the line between ordinary commerce and complicity. Standard Oil of New Jersey supplied specialized fuel additives that Germany could route through neutral states. IBM's German subsidiary, Dehomag, furnished punch card systems that enabled the Nazi bureaucracy to sort, count, and track populations with chilling efficiency. In the United States, IBM headquarters insisted that foreign units operated with substantial autonomy. The structure insulated the parent company, while allowing revenues to flow from both Allied and Axis markets. Legality and morality parted ways. Contracts and profits kept moving. Currency manipulation and commodity trades offered additional avenues for gain. Gold returned to its ancient role as the ultimate refuge. Banks with access to the international bullion markets earned fees and spreads as nervous governments and private actors scrambled to convert assets, hedge risks, or spirit wealth across borders. Swiss banks, protected by secrecy and neutrality, became custodians for depositors who would have been enemies anywhere else. Under a single roof, assets belonging to Allied ministries and Nazi officials could sit in adjacent vaults, the marble floors muffling the reality that the owners were locked in a fight to the death beyond those walls. For the international banking elite, ideological victory was less existential than institutional continuity. Survival meant diversification. They cultivated ties to German industry while keeping relations warm with London. They explored channels to maintain Japanese trade through intermediaries while securing American government contracts. They hedged across geographies and political systems so that, whichever side advanced, their institutions could absorb the shock. Neutrality in practice became a portfolio strategy. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world pivoted from destruction to reconstruction with striking speed. Europe needed capital, leadership, and a framework to prevent a repeat of the 1930s. The Marshall Plan channeled American money into rebuilding, the Bretton Woods system stabilized exchange rates, and West Germany was integrated into a Western alliance facing the Soviet Union. In this urgent project, many awkward questions about wartime financial cooperation were quietly deferred or brushed aside. Industrialists with unsavory records returned to influential roles. Banks that had handled tainted gold or enemy-linked assets emerged with reputations intact, ready to finance the new order. Some of the very figures who had exchanged polite correspondence with Nazi officials now advised Allied governments on currency regimes and credit flows. This is not a story that erases heroism or denies the moral stakes of World War II. It is a story that restores a missing layer, the shadow infrastructure that funded the gears of war. In parades, we honor soldiers. In archives, we can trace another procession of ledgers, transfers, and meetings where decisions were recorded in ink rather than blood. Power does not only reside in speeches or at the point of a bayonet. It also accumulates in signatures, in settlements, in the quiet approval of a transaction that keeps a factory humming or a fleet fueled. For some bankers, the war was not primarily about the defeat of fascism or the triumph of democracy. It was about liquidity, solvency, counterparty risk, and market access. The moral catastrophe unfolded on one ledger, profit and loss unfolded on another. By structuring exposure in multiple directions, the most sophisticated actors ensured that their institutions could emerge from the wreckage intact, sometimes stronger than before. The post-war financial system did not demolish the machinery that enabled dual dealings. It refined it. Capital became even more interconnected, regulations more complex, and the distance between legal compliance and moral accountability sometimes widened. The belief that financial obligations transcend politics remained remarkably resilient. That belief can stabilize a world economy. It can also sanitize choices that, in wartime, carry human costs far beyond a spreadsheet. The lesson is sobering. When war breaks out, nations choose sides, armies mobilize, civilians suffer. Banks, however, choose something else. They choose survival. They choose continuity. They choose profit. That does not mean every banker is cynical or every institution corrupt. It means the system rewards those who keep options open and risk diversified, even when the world is demanding stark moral clarity. Drill down on the profit, bargaining makes clear what the 50-50 moment changed. Before 1950, royalties were linked to volume. As output rose, the government's share lagged behind corporate profits. By anchoring the take at net income parity, Riyadh shared up the cycle. When prices and volumes climbed, so did the treasury. When margins compressed, both sides felt it. That alignment reduced incentives to fight over bookkeeping and redirected energy into project delivery ports, pipelines, water injection, and even the welfare bureaucracy needed to distribute revenue. Participation in the next decade was a commercial as well as a political move. Instead of an expropriation that might chill capital, the kingdom bought and negotiated its ownership over time, leaving room for long-term offtake agreements, refining joint ventures abroad, and technology pipelines into its own fields. That continuity is why Saudi Aramco didn't just inherit wells. It inherited engineering cultures, seismic imaging, enhanced oil recovery, gas processing, that let it treat the hydrocarbon base not as a fortune, but as a factory. Market management evolved likewise. The 1986 market share push sacrificed price for the purpose of discipline. Shale's surge after 2010 forced a new calculus about elasticity. The 2020 pandemic saw record demand destruction and then unprecedented coordinated cuts. OPEC Plus turned from symbolism to governance with monthly monitoring, compliance figures, and voluntary adjustments beyond formal caps. An operating model closer to a quasi-central bank for barrels. The petrodollar's plumbing is seldom visible, but always present. Contracts in USD concentrate liquidity. Shipping, insurance, and commodity financing follow the same currency rails. Saudi reserves recycle through bank balance sheets and securities, deepening America's markets and returning interest income and optionality to the kingdom. In parallel, arms sales, training arrangements, and base rights instituted a second language, security as an extension of energy cooperation. Domestic diversification is still a hard engineering problem, not a slogan. Arid landscapes demand desalination and grid planning. Manufacturing clusters need skilled labor and thick logistics. Services expansions require visa and cultural policy updates. The toolkit that mattered in oil sequencing, partnerships, scale, now applies elsewhere. Green hydrogen pilots co-located with renewables and export ports. Data centers paired with gas baseload and utility-scale PV. Aluminum and steel plants aligned with rail hubs. Tourism districts stitched to airline connectivity and visa waivers. Aramco's 2019 IPO partial and domestic was another calibrated step. It broadened ownership, anchored domestic capital markets, and codified disclosure practices while keeping strategic levers within the state. Dividend policies created predictable cash flows for public finance. At the same time, downstream acquisitions and chemicals projects hedged against margins squeezed in transport fuels as the EV transition accelerates. Sports investments operate as a triple door: brand reach, domestic industry formation, and diplomatic access. Nightclub stakes and golf tours bring broadcast rights negotiations, production crews, and sponsorship ecosystems. Inward talent flows raise local competitive levels, and pageantry creates rhythms to populate the calendar between pilgrim seasons. In critics' lexicon, this is sports washing. In project finance, it's market making, creating demand streams for venues, hotels, airlines, and advertising platforms. Human capital policies form the long horizon. University endowments and stipend programs sponsor STEM degrees. Research centers partner with global institutions on materials, AI, and energy. Visa and residence rules open channels for entrepreneurs. Meanwhile, regulations on guardianship, work permits, and driving have shifted, expanding women's labor force participation and entrepreneurship rates. Enforcement and cultural adoption remain works in progress, but the trend line is visible. Geopolitics stays messy. Missile and drone attacks from regional conflicts, maritime risks in the Red Sea and Gulf, and ever-shifting great power competition. Compartmentalization has become a policy art, holding production steady while diplomatic crises flare, keeping co-investments with Western and Asian partners in aerospace, refining, semiconductors, and ports, and mediating as rents and security concerns pull in different directions. The post-oil question isn't binary. It is a shape-of-the-curve problem. How fast does demand plateau? Which segments decline first? How do inputs for petrochemicals, aviation, and heavy industry evolve? And can new revenue pools mature before fiscal buffers are tested? Riyadh answers with portfolio design. PIF splits stakes in energetics like grid storage and hydrogen alongside platform plays in logistics, tourism, and digital infrastructure. Aramco squeezes efficiency from legacy assets while building chemicals and fuels for hard-to-abate sectors. The Khashoggi affair showed the limits of image control, but also the gravity of structure. Summits boycotted one moment, refilled the next season. Sanctions landed, yet energy meetings continued. Debates about values coexisted with contracts about volumes and price sheets. Reputation matters, but reliable spare capacity and capital reserves create counterweights few states can match. Zoom out in full, and the Saudi trajectory reads as a series of exchanges. Ideology for unity, concession for capability, participation for ownership, OPEC, discipline for price, petrodollar alignment for liquidity, sovereign portfolios for future optionality, soft power for brand permission. None were riskless. Each required timing and maintenance. But stacked together, they produced a system flexible enough to absorb shocks and adapt its story, without relinquishing its core advantage. Low-cost, scalable barrels, and the institutional tools to mobilize them. That is the context behind today's headlines about mega projects, EV investments, carbon intensity metrics, league contracts, and refinery JVs. Every announcement is a telegraph. Assure markets now, prepare industries later, and situate the kingdom at junctions of trade, energy, finance, and culture, where rents are collected not just from resources, but from coordination. The past may have been written in bitumen. The future will be edited in data, logistics, and design, but fundamentals endure: execution, scale, and timing. Consider also the quiet but crucial plumbing of standards and metrics, crude-grade benchmarks, offtake contracts with formula-based differentials, freight index linkages, and sulfur carbon intensity labels. These instruments convert policy choices into spread data small numbers, with big consequences for refiner behavior, inventory decisions, and ultimately pump prices. The kingdom's voice in standard setting is part of the influence equation, just as its share of spare capacity is part of the volume equation. At street level, the transition feels less like abrupt departure and more like addition. Older energy flows keep grids running while layers are stacked. Solar parks, wind farms, smart meters, EV charging, green ammonia modules, each requiring new skills, contract types, and governance tools. Banking, too, adjusts. Green bonds, sukuk for infrastructure, export credit for heavy industry, and venture funds for platform startups. Policymakers borrow from oil-era experience, clear price signals, bankable contracting frameworks, and scale procurement to pull cost curves down. Risks remain: oil price whipsaws, execution bottlenecks, skill gaps, regional flare-ups, and global recession cycles. But margin of error is constructed with reserves: financial, geological, institutional. The historical playbook incrementalism, with punctuations, suggests responses: temporary stimulus when prices dip, capex rephasing when supply chains jam, alliance management when diplomacy runs white-hot, and narrative adjustments when sentiment turns. The story thus built tracks from an 18th century pact to 21st century platforms. It is about the conversion of advantage into institutions: mosques and majlis in the founding era, concessions, ports, and runways in the industrial era, now data centers, standards bodies, and global broadcast windows. In the aggregate, these create optionality. If you need barrels, you call. If you need investors, you pitch. If you need an audience, you program. That optionality. Not a single data point explains the durability of the Saudi arc. If you made it this far, drop a plus in the comments your badge for finishing the deep dive. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more long-form stories where money, history, and power collide. Curious about earlier empires of capital? Check out our Others video.